On campus.
And online.
Online.
This
is
URN.
Hello, we are live on University Radio Nottingham. This is The Big Picture. Good afternoon. Joining me today, we have Luke.
Hello.
And Anoushka.
Hello.
And I am, of course, Felix Hawes, in case you have forgotten. Well, again, very quiet week in the news. It's a pity, really. We haven't got much to discuss, other than the fact that our Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has resigned after 45 days, the shortest ever Prime Minister in the history of our country. And candidates are already lining up, ready to replace her, including Boris Johnson, if you remember him. Well, the big news is, of course, that the lettuce did outlast Liz Truss, and I am holding the Daily Star's paper where we have "Let us rejoice" with the lettuce, the famous lettuce, that I believe is 500 to 1 favourite to be the next Prime Minister. And I'd like to ask our panel first, what do you think Liz Truss's resignation was the correct thing to do, or do you think it actually would have been better for the Conservative Party, and indeed perhaps the country, for her to have continued on in the role?
I think it became clear about a week ago, perhaps when the new Chancellor came in, that her authority as Prime Minister was just shot. It's very clear that if you can't hold on to the top offices in government after only 45 days, there is a clear lack of authority, and so the right move at that point was to resign.
I think I'm going to have to agree. I don't think she really necessarily had the mandate really to kind of govern her own party or the country. I think, as we can see, the party is clearly so divided on this issue.
So such a short-lived Prime Minister. This is a very a lot of turmoil, a lot of political turmoil in the Conservative Party. And let's not forget that the Conservative Party has an 80-seat majority. What do you think it was about Liz Truss? Oh, some celebration outside the studio because it is the Student Radio Awards, so it's possible that the Big Picture itself might be nominated, but let's not count our chickens before they've hatched. Anyway, back to Liz Truss. Liz Truss, yeah, what do you think it was about Liz Truss then that made her so unpopular amongst the Conservative MPs as well as the country? Let's not forget the Conservatives are polling at 18%, if not lower in some polls, 14%, which is the record-breaking low. Is it, do you think, the fact that the Conservative Party members backed Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak when Conservative MPs backed Rishi Sunak over Liz Truss?
It's important that you highlight that although there is an 80-seat majority, it was not Liz Truss's 80-seat majority, and there's no sense of residual loyalty for the Conservative Party towards Liz Truss. She came in with a very confident programme, the kind of programme one might have when you've won an 80-seat majority in a general election, but one that you clearly cannot force through when somebody else has won the seats and somebody else opted for a very different kind of economic programme. Everything in Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget was odious to the Conservative Party, or at least to large shares of the Conservative Party. And it was immediately clear when she went on such a policy reversal so early and so decisively that things were going to be very tough for her right at the start of her reign.
I actually really think what we're seeing in the party is still this massive loyalty to Boris Johnson. I mean, you can just see through his potential comeback. I do think the issue is that the sentiment in the party, and even amongst some of the MPs, is that they really didn't want Boris to go. And I think that has led to this kind of massive vacuum in the party, really, for power, because you have your Boris loyalists who want to put him back in number 10 no matter what. And then you have your centrists who potentially might be defecting to parties like the Lib Dems and don't really have a voice in the party. And then you kind of have what I would say are more your kind of MPs and the voter base who's more on the right of the party, who kind of support Brexit massively and support stricter immigration, and I think actually have the largest voice currently in the party due to groups like the ERG.
Very interesting, very interesting. And the ERG are expected to meet on Monday to discuss who they are going to back. They're about a 60-member group, if not higher. So if they vote on force, that will be very significant. And it is potentially that it is thinking they will be backing Boris Johnson. Now, for our listeners at home, the 1922 Backbench Committee, led by Sir Graham Brady, is the body that oversees the election of the Conservative Party leader. And the rules for this contest are different to previous ones, including the one that we had over the summer not that long ago, where Liz Truss beat Rishi Sunak. The rules are that MPs have to get 100 nominations. Now that means only a maximum of 3 candidates can actually go into the leadership contest. Now, if it is the case that 3 enter, there will be a vote on Monday to get it down to 2, and those 2 will then go to the membership. If only 1 candidate gets past the 100, then they will be automatically crowned Tory leader, and the King will ask them to form a government. So the 3 that are likely to enter the race, only one of which is actually confirmed at the moment, is Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and Penny Mordaunt. Penny Mordaunt being the one that has officially declared her candidacy. Although it is only Rishi Sunak that has crossed the 100 mark of backers, according to the Guido Fawkes website, and the BBC Now also support this claim. Boris Johnson has also claimed now that he has reached past the 100 mark, though we're unsure whether or not that is the case. Now, we discussed in the last segment there, both of you mentioned about Boris Johnson and the party being loyal to him. Let us not forget, of course, though, that Boris Johnson was removed by the Conservative MPs. It is likely that a majority of the Conservative MPs do not back him, but all he requires is 99 other MPs, him being the one that would get it to 100, for him to make it through to the membership. Now, for me, although I am neutral, I see there to be 3 possibilities, and I'd like to know what you think, or 3 or 4 possibilities that could happen next, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on these 4 possibilities, and if you have any other outcomes that you think are likely, then please do say those too. So, in my opinion, I think it is likely that one of these 4 options will happen. So either 1, Rishi Sunak is the only one that makes it past 100, and therefore Rishi Sunak will be automatically crowned leader of the Conservative Party. Option 2, Rishi and Boris both make it past 100, and Boris wins because he has more backing of the membership. You may disagree with that. You may think they might back Rishi. Please do say so in a minute if you think that. 3, Boris realises that he can't get a majority, and therefore he tells his supporters to back Penny because she is the best option in beating Rishi. And so therefore Penny and Rishi go through, and the members pick Penny, or they might pick Rishi, but the polls seem to indicate that they would pick Penny. That's option 3. Or option 4, all 3 of them make it through, and one gets knocked out, which is likely to be Boris Johnson, and then it's Penny versus Rishi in the membership, which maybe Penny would win according to polls. I know I've sort of slightly skewed away from impartiality there, but they appear to me as the host to be the 4 likely outcomes. Of course, we haven't mentioned Suella Braverman, who also resigned as Home Secretary earlier this week after a debacle with her emails, although in her letter of resignation it seemed to indicate that there were differences on immigration with Liz Truss. It's reported asking Suella Braverman to make immigration easier into the country, which Suella Braverman didn't want to do. So where Suella Braverman and the more hard right go in their support is crucial. If it's split and they don't all back the same candidate, it's possible that only Rishi will make it through. So I know that's a very long-winded introduction to this question, but what do you think are the likely outcomes, and what do you think is the most likely outcome of the very short 1 week, just over 1 week leadership contest?
I think the nightmare option for the Conservative Party would be for example, Rishi Sunak gets by far and away the largest number of nominations, and Boris Johnson gets, let's say, 101, and then it goes to the members, and the members choose Boris, which does, I think, seem fairly likely based on what we know from the Conservative membership. But then we would have a returning Prime Minister Johnson with with almost no leg to stand on, no authority in the party, and a deeply entrenched division against him. So that's one option, and that's the nightmare scenario. I think it's probably pretty unlikely. Based on the way they've articulated the rules, I think the 1922 committee are very committed to making sure that doesn't happen, and are creating a situation where probably the most likely outcome is Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt go over 100. Boris either does or doesn't, but is in any case eliminated on Monday, and then the members vote for, frankly, whoever they vote for. I don't think it seems to matter to the 1922 committee whether Mordaunt or Sunak go through, as long as one of the two of them does. So that's what I think was probably the most likely outcome, with various combinations involving Boris, ranging from he's eliminated on Monday to it goes through to the members and he wins. They're all things that the system seems to be configured in such a way as to reduce the likelihood of that happening. Certainly, I don't think there's room for Braverman or Kemi Badenoch or any of the other challengers to get 100 nominations. I think, again, the rules, as they've been articulated, are designed to create, at the most, this three-way contest that you've just articulated. And it's all going to be over in a week, they say, which is I think reflects a profound anxiety in the Conservative Party about their position and the public pressure for a general election that will inevitably result out of this, regardless of who wins. The Conservative Party are deathly afraid of their entire kind of popular legitimacy eroding away as the public watch as the polls decline further and further every day, and certainly another 3-month-long leadership election would have done a great deal of damage to what little remains of their governing authority.
Interesting. It's interesting you think Penny Mordaunt will go across the 100 mark. Anoushka, do you think that is likely, that Penny will do that, and what do you think is likely to happen?
See, I think it's interesting. I do think Penny was very much, the first time we had the leadership rounds for the Conservative Party leader, I do think Penny was one of the grassroots favourites. I'm not sure if she would have the support of all the MPs, and even though I do like some of her ideas, I do wonder if she necessarily has enough cabinet experience for the role. That's something that I think would be interesting, and I do think if it was a situation, if Boris wasn't to get the 100 MPs needed, then I do think he would come in support of Penny, and that could potentially sway things in that direction. I think it's really interesting this is all happening in a week. I mean, I think it really just does go to show that a week in politics is a long time in these current times. I don't think Braverman will necessarily run. I don't really think she has enough of the party to support her. But I do think it's really interesting that I think I saw something on Twitter, which probably isn't the most trustworthy place to be quoting from, but I think it said something about I'm not sure if he has announced or he was going to announce support for Rishi, and potentially Kemi Badenoch was also going to announce support for Rishi, and I think that would be really interesting in terms of how many MPs are actually going to come out in support of Rishi versus Boris. But I do think if it was a situation, a Rishi versus Boris, and then put to the members, I think we would see how divided the Conservative Party truly is, because I think it's important to note that in the first time there was the leadership elections, there were enough voters who didn't vote, and I think you could say that was probably a protest vote because they really didn't want Boris to go. I think no matter the outcome of this kind of leadership election, whether it goes down to membership votes or not, the party is so clearly divided, and I do think this will potentially be leading to a general election, maybe after local elections, because we do have local elections coming up. Well, I think they're coming up in May, but I think we might see a general election in the new year, potentially.
I'm not sure anyone has enough experience, frankly. On the first point that you made, it occurred to me that, I'm pretty sure Sunak was a 2019 MP. Mordaunt, I think, was 2015, perhaps, but hasn't been in government particularly long out of that time. And although Boris has been an MP since somewhere in the mid-2000s, perhaps, he no matter how much time he spends in government, I don't think I'll think of him as an experienced figure. We are very much at the point now, 12 years into this Conservative government, that it feels like all there has been a form of brain drain almost, where the people who propelled the David Cameron government and even the Theresa May government have been, for the most part, either purged or retired or have simply left politics in a state of despair over what has happened roughly since the Brexit vote. And so we're now in a situation where, regardless of whether it's Rishi or Penny, out of the two, shall we say, most reasonable candidates, they're both inexperienced, and they're both facing a tremendous challenge with a divided party that I think even an extraordinarily talented and experienced politician would have a really tough time with the state of the party at the moment. And so no matter what happens here, we're likely to see a new Prime Minister coming into very shaky ground with a very divided and hostile party that they presumably will not have the experience to deal with.
See, I wouldn't necessarily call Rishi Sunak inexperienced. I think if you remember back to the 2019 election when Boris wouldn't go on to kind of do the live debates, it was actually Rishi who was put on, and I think he was an excellent speaker. And I think you can see that, and I think unfortunately that's one of his downfalls. People find him too slick as a kind of a public speaker, and I think that's where Liz Truss massively lacked. She could not speak. She was not a natural orator, and that really came across. And I think another issue with Rishi is, I think when it comes down to the electoral vote or even the members, people find him to be too out of touch. So I don't think it's necessarily that he hasn't got the experience to lead the party. I'm just not sure to what extent he can actually unify it, or really any of the three options can really unify the party.
I think he is quite an effective communicator. I think, but to be fair, almost anyone would look like an effective communicator next to Liz Truss, who, I really thought Theresa May was the bottom of the barrel when it came to public communication, but I think we've seen a new depth today. I do think communication in politics counts for a tremendous amount, and Sunak does have some of the similar, I think you use the word slickness, and I think that's exactly right. That's the David Cameron style of communication, but unlike David Cameron even, you're right, he does come across as being a child of the establishment, and very much, his wife is a multi-billionaire. I saw a tweet calling him a trophy husband, and which, that's not a good look for a prime minister. And one of the strengths, I think, of Penny Mordaunt, in fact, is that she is relatively working class for a Conservative MP. She has a bit of what we might call John Major energy, where she's more capable of speaking the public's language. I don't know whether that will win her any favours with the Conservative Party. I think probably not. But certainly when it comes to speaking to the public, and when it comes to a general election, whenever that comes, I would wonder, out of Mordaunt versus Sunak, whether Mordaunt would have an edge in that kind of arena.
Well, this is very interesting about Penny Mordaunt. Would she have an advantage? Because the thing is with Penny Mordaunt is she's a risk for many Conservative MPs, because they do not know what she would be like in that situation, because she's relatively unknown by the general public, and that didn't pay off with Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak is well known, and at the height of his chancellorship he was very popular. Then there was a lot of scandals that came out about him, probably from the Boris Johnson camp. We can't say that for certain, and that made his ratings plummet. But he's still, in the general population, the most popular of the three candidates that are likely to get this. Other points I'd like to bring up that were mentioned, about the nature of the party and how it changed after Brexit. That's very important to note that up until the reappointment of Jeremy Hunt as into the cabinet when he became Chancellor, not a single person in Liz Truss's cabinet had been in the cabinet in 2016 with David Cameron, other than herself, Liz Truss. Also, your comparison to John Major, that Titus would love that. Titus, who's one of our big picture regulars, is a John Major fan, so he would have appreciated that. I just wanted, before I ask you more questions, I just want to mention that we do have a messaging in platform, which you can find on the online University Radio Nottingham page when you are listening to us, and you can message in your thoughts, so please do. Someone already has, someone called Nadia. She says, only moral uncapable candidate is Rishi. As if Tories aren't enough of a laughing stock, bring back Boris would be the nail in the coffin. Only Rishi can stabilise the country, and forbid is the out-of-touch membership who get to vote. And that is, of course, the case, that if really it gets the membership, Rishi Sunak is unlikely to get it. So he can only really get it if he's crowned. Before we go into a bit of guessing what would happen if each of these candidates do win, I just want to ask you, just say their name if you don't mind. Of the three, who do you think will be Prime Minister by the big picture next week? Luke, who do you think it will be?
I think it's Sunak.
And Anoushka, who do you think it's going to be?
That's a really difficult question. I do think Rishi.
Rishi, okay.
I have to agree.
So let's talk about hypotheticals now. So you both think Rishi, but it is tight. If Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister, do you think it's possible we'll see some defections to Reform UK, the former Brexit party as it was known, as Nigel Farage has started to suggest on Twitter and on GB News that there needs to be some defections from the Conservative Party to get another one of his many adventures going again. Do you think that could happen? Alternatively, sorry to interrupt you there, alternatively, Boris Johnson, if he gets in, how many defections do you think we're likely to see? Already, some MPs such as Sir Roger Gale have announced that they would resign the party whip if Boris Johnson became the leader of the Conservative Party and subsequently Prime Minister again. And also, this is a long-winded question again, but if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister and the Privilege Committee the Standards Committee, the Privileges and Standards Committee, I think it's called, that are investigating him over whether he lied to Parliament over Partygate, find him guilty and then find it necessary to give him the harshest punishment, which is a by-election in his seat, and he loses because his seat is not a Conservative stronghold, it is a marginal seat, and he loses that by-election, it's entirely possible that he'll be gone by Christmas and we'll have another Conservative leadership election this year. What do you think?
On the subject of will the right of the party defect in the event of a Rishi or Penny victory, I don't think that's particularly likely. I think the right of the party will be increasingly acrimonious about the new administration, but they ultimately they know that the only chance, and it is indeed a dwindling chance at this point, of holding on to their seats at the next general election is with the Conservative Party machine behind them. Defecting to a party, particularly a party like Reform UK, which does not have any parliamentary seats and does not look to be winning any parliamentary seats in the next general election, that would be electoral suicide. And I think there are maybe a small number of Conservative MPs who are that ideologically committed that they might consider it. But we would need to be in a situation as we were in, I think, 2019 when the Brexit Party were getting a significant share of the vote for anyone to seriously consider defecting. On the subject of do I think MPs could defect to the Lib Dems or Labour if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister, yes, I think that's fairly likely. I think what remains, and this is the dregs at this point of the left and the centre of the Conservative Party, are just so despondent about what's happened. As you saw, I can't remember the name of the backbencher, but he gave a wonderful 2 minutes to the BBC on the day Liz Truss resigned, and he said he was just livid. That is, I think, the general feeling of anybody other than the right of the Conservative Party at the moment. And with Keir Starmer's Labour looking so certain to win the next election for a start, and so relatively electable, I definitely think for a Conservative MP in a marginal seat who is looking at almost certain defeat in 2025, a defection to Labour would suddenly look very tempting indeed. And on the subject of Boris, I don't think the Privileges Commission will force a by-election. I wish that they would, and I think the scale of his offences are such that would be a proportional response. I don't think they would go so far as to force a by-election on a sitting Prime Minister, because if they did, it's almost certain he would lose. With the polls as they are, and with Uxbridge, his constituency, so much of a marginal in normal times, I think we would be looking at a screaming Labour victory in that seat, and indeed a Prime Minister unseated by a by-election during their term, which I'm a historian, so I should know, but I don't think that's ever happened before.
Yes, I don't think it has either. And it was Charles Walker, the backbencher that the BBC interviewed. Yes. Anoushka, what do you think to that?
I think with the whole Boris Johnson thing, I do think it's very interesting to note that he almost did lose his seat in the 2019 election. I think there were even talks of trying to make him stand somewhere in a more Conservative safe seat, which I think I mean, if that was the situation back in 2019, I think it would be even more disastrous now.
I think the outcome would be that he would be parachuted in at the next. Perhaps they might even convince an old Conservative MP to retire and force a by-election in a very strong Conservative seat. Like Theresa May's Maidenhead, for example, is like a 40,000 Conservative majority. Even in this electoral wipeout that we're looking at now, Maidenhead will still be blue. There will be a place for them to slot Boris Johnson back in if he begged enough. But certainly it would be the end of his prime ministerial ambitions, I think. We do occasionally see government ministers losing their jobs to by-elections. Off the top of my head, there was an event in the 1960s where an MP called Patrick Gordon Walker was appointed Foreign Secretary in the shadow cabinet and then failed to be elected, and so he was parachuted in, there was an attempting parachute situation in another seat which he also lost, and then he simply left politics at that point.
And
Go on.
I think even in the next general election, there are some very big, prominent names in the Conservative Party who have been rumoured to be actually going to be losing their seats. I think IDS is one of the very...
Yes, and Dominic Raab. And in fact, an opinion poll with which had the Conservatives at the record low 14%, which suggests only 5 Conservative MPs would be returned. Now, it's unlikely that that will be replicated in the general election, but this does sort of link to a question from one of our listeners, Jess, who has asked about whether or not we will see a general election before the summer of 2023, and if so, will the Conservatives have a wipeout, perhaps in the same fashion, if not worse, than their 1997 performance, which was their worst performance ever in a general election in their very long history?
I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a general election before, I think it's January 2025, the latest
right.
it can be. Yeah, because we know from looking at events like the poll tax riots, for example, sustained intense public pressure can cause the government to backtrack on a serious commitment. But the list of examples is not very long. I think I could count them on one hand, at least for the back half of the 20th century. So it would have to be a very extraordinary event for public pressure to force the government to call an early general election, particularly, as we know, with the majority being so high. We would need to see, a great many by-election defeats and a number of defections before it looks to a Prime Minister, Mordaunt, Sunak or Johnson, that a general election is actually their best chance. We might see an early general election if there is a fabled new leader bounce for the person who comes in, which we didn't see a new leader bounce for Truss, for example, not that she had the time to enjoy one anyway, but if the new leader receives just a little uptick in the polls and perhaps Labour doesn't manage to capitalise on the chaos as much as they should, we might see a new leader like Theresa May in 2017 thinking, well, this is perhaps my only chance to secure a mandate. But again, the polls are so desperately bad for the Conservatives at this point that I just don't think they will until they've truly ran out their time, as John Major did in the 90s, of course, in the lead up to that shattering defeat in 1997.
I think it's very important, whoever is the next Conservative Party leader, that the main aim for them is to try to not have such a disastrous next general election, because I don't think it's a question of whether the Conservatives will lose the next election. It's a matter of when they're going to lose the next election. And I think it's very interesting considering historically they have been kind of Britain's most successful party. And I can't remember where I read an article being like, could this be the end of kind of the Conservatives' electoral success? We've had 12 years of kind of Conservative rule, arguably very divided kind of leadership at certain points. Is this going to mark the next decade of potentially a Keir Starmer government?
It might be the end of the traditional position of the Conservative Party as the party of government. I mean, it's worth remembering that in the period since 1945, only 3 men have seized power from the Conservatives as Labour. That's Attlee, Wilson and Blair in 70 years. And if you count the number of years in power in the post-war period, the Conservatives are miles ahead. particularly now, of course, after 12 years. But we may be seeing an end to what has now become the traditional position in post-war British politics of the Conservatives in power and Labour in opposition, because it's almost as if things have flipped. We're now seeing a Conservative Party that looks the way the Labour Party did in the 1980s, riven by factional strife and with ideological extremism rising on the wings. We now see the Labour Party looking shockingly united and shockingly cogent in its arguments. I mean, the common argument against Keir Starmer is that he's boring, and I think that's probably a fairly good thing to have be your detractor's strongest point, is that you're boring. When you look at the state of the Conservative Party, perhaps the British public would rather enjoy some boring at this point.
Well, we could probably talk about this for a lot longer. Very interesting points made by you both, but we are going to come to the end of our first section. I just want to touch upon another question Jess has asked us. Do you think we will see any MPs lose the whip after the shenanigans that happen on Wednesday when the new Prime Minister comes in? This is probably referring to the fracking vote, which was a confidence issue, then it wasn't, then it was, and the whip resigned and unresigned. I'll quickly answer that just for the sake of time, so we can move on to the topic of fracking, which is after the break. I don't think so. I think that whole thing will just be ignored. But it's an interesting one. Do follow the big picture URN underscore in between all those words on Instagram for more updates. And we are on YouTube if you want to listen back to any of our shows. And we're hoping to also be on Spotify as well. So we are going to take a quick break now before moving on to fracking. So in honour of goodbye to Liz Truss, there she goes.
University. 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 This is University Radio Nottingham.
Hello and welcome back to the Big Picture live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. Our second topic is fracking. But just before that, I want to read another comment from our listeners, from Lucy and Ollie, who are enjoying the show all the way from Essex. So we are now having listeners outside of Nottinghamshire, which is, of course, fantastic. Thank you to you both. I hope you're both having a lovely weekend in Essex. So our second topic of today is fracking. So there was a vote. We mentioned this. We touched on this at the end of the last section. And there was a vote. Labour put forward a motion to ban fracking, as it's been mooted by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the current business secretary. Let's see how long he lasts on that post. Of restoring fracking. It was quite a frenzy. And the chief whip and the deputy chief whip, as I mentioned earlier, resigned and unresigned in the whole thing. Fracking is a very contentious issue in the Conservative Party. There's a lot of MPs that are very sceptical of it because of the nature of how it will interact with their constituencies. Obviously, it's very disruptive. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages of fracking, as there is for most things. But what do our panellists think in the broad scheme of fracking? Are you yay? Are you nay? Are you, well, it depends where? Where do you sit on the issue?
I think it's a method of energy generation that makes sense in places like the United States, where it has been done quite widely, where you can put the machinery far out in the Nevada desert and there's no chance of you affecting anybody. It's fine in those circumstances, though even then potentially not necessarily desirable. But in a country like Britain, with the population density that we have, and what green spaces we have are fairly precious to us, I don't think it's realistic, and particularly because it's just more fossil fuels at the end of the day. It's not a technology which we think has a future in 30, 50 years from now. It's a stopgap measure at best, and one that leaves us with permanent environmental scars, which I think future generations will look upon with bafflement, to be honest.
Anoushka, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I do think that vote in the House of Commons was very controversial. There were rumours of Jacob Rees-Mogg kind of forcing people and dragging them quite physically to vote against the motion. I think I'm going to have to agree. I think fracking is something that works possibly better in larger countries where it's legal in the US and Canada, Whereas in kind of smaller countries, I know most of Europe is very much against fracking. I don't think it necessarily makes sense for the UK. I think it's clearly a very highly controversial topic, not just in this country, but around the globe as well.
Well, you mentioned about it being fossil fuels. It is cleaner than coal, but there does release nitrogen dioxides, but it's estimated an increase of between 1 and 4%. And again, I think, Luke, you mentioned about the size of the UK compared to other countries that might do fracking like the US. Well, the British Geological Survey indicated that actually, if we were to use fracking to its full extent, it would only cover about 46% of the UK's total energy consumption. So actually, we wouldn't be energy self-sufficient. But what do you make to the point about the fact that it could create a lot of jobs, 64,000 jobs, according to Ernst & Young? What do you think to that? Is it worth it for the jobs?
I think there are better ways to create jobs, frankly. There are, as you say, it could satisfy a certain percentage of our energy needs, though apparently there are a number of estimates ranging from as high as 60% to as low as 3%, depending on who you ask and what their methodology is. So if indeed there is a controversy about the scale to which it could be employed, that also implies there will be a great variance in the number of jobs it will create as well. But frankly, there are ways for governments to create jobs that don't involve permanent environmental harm. And there are ways for us to secure our energy independence in the future that don't involve fossil fuels, frankly. Although we are dependent on them at the moment, and I imagine we will be for quite some time yet, we should be looking forward with our energy policy, not backwards, and the future is clearly in renewables. It relates to the debate about nuclear energy, which I think is a very practical and useful source of power, but not one which is fit for the United Kingdom of 2060, for example. And I think fracking falls even further into that category, where had we been having this discussion in 1965, we might have said, yes, all right, there's a long-term future for fossil fuels for at least another 100 years. There does not seem to be a long-term future for non-renewable energy, certainly in the world, in Britain at large.
I do think the point about bringing jobs to the UK, I think that is very interesting, but I do think it would be better on bringing more kind of greener jobs with like renewable energies, and that's really kind of where I think investments should be going into, kind of solar panels and potentially, I think maybe the door for nuclear energy is potentially passed. I think Nick Clegg in 2010 said that there would be no point and it would take too long. But I think maybe if we started in 2010, by today, maybe we would be in a better off position in terms of the cost of living crisis and all our energy supplies.
There was a very short-term thinking there by the coalition government about nuclear energy, which divides those that are in favour of finding alternatives to fossil fuels. In a time where we are having difficulty with energy, which is causing the cost of living crisis, which has been caused by a variety of factors and made worse by the war in Ukraine, do you not think that fracking, despite the fact that there are negatives about it, it does disrupt communities, it does release some dangerous toxins on a small level and the potential for small level earthquakes as well? I think 2.9 on the Richter scale was recorded somewhere in Canada recently. I think that's the case. But do you think maybe it's worth it when we are in such a perilous time in terms of being able to afford our energy?
I don't think there's a good short-term solution to the energy problem caused by the war in Ukraine, and we can't allow the war in Ukraine to be used to justify things that ultimately aren't going to pay off for a number of years. The nature of fracking is that although the lead time is shorter than, for example, building a nuclear power plant, which I think is a 1 decade plus kind of investment, which might not have a return, even if fracking is useful to us within 5 years, the war in Ukraine is probably not going to be happening in 5 years. We don't know what our energy situation will be like in 5 years, but we should hope that it's less insecure than it is now. And so making long-term political decisions based on short-term political circumstances just does not seem like a wise idea to me.
I do think we have to have a more kind of looking towards the future outlook when it comes to kind of the energy question, really. I think that's why there should be more investments and a larger focus on green renewable energy, because I do think that's where the future lies. I don't think it's sustainable to be living off fossil fuels for generations to come. And if we put in the work now, I think it will pay off later.
Interesting. Of course, it was reported by the Truss administration that they were going to look into banning solar farms on most land, which I imagine is something that you would be against, Anoushka. But we'll see what happens about that now that the Truss government is out, and if Boris comes back in or Rishi, both of them are pro net zero, so and probably anti-fracking. So we'll see what happens regarding that. If you're interested in the environment issues, well, University Radio Nottingham does have another show that is dedicated to environmental issues called Eco Frenzy, which is on a Saturday from 3 till 4. And I can say on the radio that Eco Frenzy have been nominated for the Student Radio Awards, so well done to them. The Big Picture sadly missed this year. To remind our audience at home, you can tune in online, and on the online platform you can message in. So we'd be delighted to read some more of your messages. But we're going to take a second break now before going to our third topic, which is about China and about former RAF pilots being employed by the Chinese Communist Party to train some of their staff. But before then, as we are in potential danger, I thought that this song, SOS, was appropriate.
On campus.
And online. Online.
This is
URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. Our third and final topic of today's show is on China. Well, 30 ex-fast jet pilots, it is believed, from Britain, have been employed on about a £24,000 salary to train members of the Chinese Communist Party. This links basically to the bigger global picture, the big picture, funny, about China and its global role. And recently another story has come out, which I don't know if our panelists have seen. I didn't put it on the Big Picture chat to discuss, but the former president of China, and apologies if I butcher this name, but Hu Jintao was escorted out of the closing session of the CCP's Congress, I believe, more recently. So a political struggle perhaps going on there as well. And what do we make of this about China's influence? Jess has messaged in, so we'll touch on this as well if you can feed this into your question. She said, we've seen what inaction from the West leads to with how Russia was able to invade Ukraine. Do you think being more hardline with China will avoid situations like what's happened to Ukraine and Hong Kong for places such as Taiwan? Very interesting question. So, so what do you make to this story and linking it to the bigger picture, such as what Jess has brought up? Jess from Cornwall.
On the subject of the pilots, I think that speaks, as you say, to a broader question of our engagement with China and how China seems to exist in a strange relationship with the West at the moment, where we're neither enemies nor friends, and I think that's likely to continue for some time, even as Xi Jinping consolidates his power, as indeed he's doing this week. It's clear that we don't feel as negatively towards China as we do towards Russia, but we're sort of afraid that seems to be the direction that we're going in. And China, although it flirted with a friendship with Putin during the start of the Ukraine war, does not seem to be following a pro-Putin line generally. They seem to be taking a more ambivalent stance, and that indicates, for them at least, I think a policy of sit around and see. Certainly they don't want to be linking themselves to a loser, as it seems Putin is going to be. They have a much more long-term view of foreign policy, and that is indeed evidenced in this headhunting the fighter pilots. They're not interested in a confrontation with the West tomorrow. And I don't think, despite some reports about their intention to invade Taiwan this year, I don't think that will happen either. I think they're looking towards a possible confrontation with the West in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, when they're either much closer to parity with the US, or they've even gone out ahead of the US in terms of economic output and industrialization and technological progress and what have you. This is very much a longer term story, certainly than what's going on with Russia. And about Hu Jintao, final point, that is obviously, that's literally just happened this afternoon. It's a very developing story, and we've no idea what it really represents. But it wouldn't be out of character, I don't think, for Xi Jinping to make a statement of removing not necessarily a rival, but a hallmark of an earlier era so publicly. There's no, as far as I can see, visible reason that removing Hu Jintao had to happen so publicly in front of audiences of perhaps 1 billion people watching the most significant political event in Chinese history in the last 5 years. It was most certainly an intentional statement to get rid of him in the way that it happened this afternoon. And so that speaks, I think, to Xi Jinping's desire to consolidate his power very publicly.
I do think that the story with the kind of the CCP trying to attract ex-RAF fighter pilots to try to train their own, I think that is something that we should be very concerned about. I don't think former people who might have been exposed to very highly sensitive documents should be allowed to interact with China. I do think it's interesting that you said that China aren't our friends or our enemies, but I do think they kind of like that, because I think China it's not really concerned with being friends with any countries. I think they just want to kind of, in a way, expand their own economy and build themselves up as kind of a global superpower to rival the US. And I do think it is really important to note that whilst China may seem on the same level as the US, militarily it is nowhere compared. It has not got the same military might as the US does, which I think is really interesting. Which is why I kind of feel like now, with the whole issues in Taiwan, even though some US officials are saying that they're potentially due to invade in a year, which I doubt, because I don't think they have the long-term planning to carry out a mission like that. I think now is kind of our 2014, 2015 Crimea moment. We need to be re-examining and being much harsher on China than we ever were on Russia, to avoid potential economic crashes, because I think the entire of the West is so economically tied towards China, and if we impose sanctions on them, ultimately that's only going to hurt our own economies, and we really need to stop our kind of dependence on China and Chinese production, and really be examining our relationship with them and thinking that we need to find somewhere else to find a new manufacturer to export goods to. Yeah,
it's clear, I think, from this year and from the war in Ukraine that economic entanglement does not work as a political tool. You know, it's long been mooted in Germany that they would pacify Russia by economically entangling themselves with Russia, and in essence, all that's happened is the opposite. Now the tail is wagging the dog, and the Russians have a very strong grip on Germany through the gas supply. We risk running into a similar situation with China, I think, in the future, if we don't ensure that our economy is not overly dependent on them. I don't think it's necessarily a guarantee that China will continue to consolidate power around Xi. I don't think the current era of autocracy is necessarily permanent, and indeed we're only 10 years out from Hu Jintao being in charge in a much more collegial and collaborative form of government, which was much, think of the 2008 Beijing Olympics and China opening up to the world, and the economic entanglements that they were seeking rather than receiving with the West at that time. We could see a return to that in China. I don't know if we will. Nobody knows if we will, certainly. But we should take precautions to ensure that if China goes in an additionally autocratic direction, we don't end up, as Germany has now done with Russia, where we are facing a recession or worse if we oppose them.
Well, the thing is, of course, if China does invade Taiwan, as has been mooted, then that will result in nuclear war. If we believe President Biden, who has said on multiple occasions, perhaps with his national security advisors not wishing him to say it, but he has said that if China invaded Taiwan, the US would respond with nuclear weapons. So it's a very heightened time, and it's interesting you mentioned as well, is China our friend or our enemy? Well, they haven't been, and about backing Putin, they did, of course, abstain in the United Nations on the condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So they didn't back Putin, but of course they didn't actually say, yes, Russia has invaded Ukraine. President Xi Jinping, it had been rumoured until recently that he had lost his grip of power in China, but the removal of the former president today would suggest perhaps that was a little bit of an exaggeration. So China is... Do you think China is going to surpass the US in its power within the next 10 years? I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that China basically has till 2030 to surpass the US, and if it doesn't do it by then, it never will. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't think this is a question that can be reasonably considered on a 10-year timescale. I think, obviously, there's a kind of looming demographic collapse hanging over China's head with this, 30, 40 years of the one-child policy creating an upturned population pyramid where they have vastly more old people than young people. And so how they're going to navigate that, I don't know. But certainly they aren't thinking in terms of 10-year timescales. They won't be surpassing the US within 10 years. They would hope, and certainly I think Xi Jinping hopes to surpass the US within half a century, or perhaps less than that if things go really well. But it's not a 10-year question, it's a 20, 30, 40-year question at best.
Anoushka, what do you think briefly, just before we wrap up on today's programme?
Yeah, I don't think that China will be in a position to really overtake the US in the next 10 years. I think we probably underestimate kind of the US's military might. Really, it's still very strong in that kind of arena. But I do think it is interesting that China has kind of been increasingly, not kind of on an economic side, has kind of been infiltrating countries, I guess, on what you could call maybe a more kind of soft power play. Like, I think, for example, our own university has ties to China through different campuses. There's one campus, Jubilee campus, I think a lot of the buildings have actually been paid for by China, and we see this across the globe as well. We see it in kind of other countries, China basically funding railways systems for different countries, and I think that is kind of really the area of focus that we need to be way more cautionary about, and that is one area that we can be.
Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much. Just before we wrap up, I would like to thank our regular listeners, George Scotland's aunt, my parents, Ella, and Lucy and Ollie, and I think Amy and James are going to be tuning in when it's available on YouTube or Spotify. I'd like to thank maybe our new listeners, or at least people that I've not heard from before, but thank you for messaging in, Jess and Nadia. This has been The Big Picture with Felix Hawes on University Radio Nottingham. Thank you very much to Anoushka and to Luke for coming on, both of them for the first time. We'll see who's Prime Minister by this point next week. Until then, as we've been talking about the RAF and China and the threat of China, please enjoy Danger Zone.